Junkyard Joe is a comic that I wish I enjoyed more than I actually did. After reading through it, I was trying to convince myself it was better than it actually was, and I think that this is something we all do to an extent. We can easily get married to an idea or fall into an overwhelmingly unrealistic sense of positivity that we forget criticisms can be levied against art and it not be done in such a harsh manner. On this channel, I try my best to focus mainly on things that I like, because after all, why would I make a video on something I did not enjoy? I would rather just speak on the comics and stories that really made an impression on me. So, why am I talking about this comic then? We need some context first. Junkyard Joe was written by Geoff Johns and drawn by both Gary Frank as well as Brad Anderson. It was released in 2023 and belongs in the unnamed universe along with other titles from Image such as Redcoat and Geiger. This comic follows the Vietnam veteran Maury Davis, nicknamed Muddy by his fellow troops, who has since retired from his job as a cartoonist, drawing in the Sunday papers his comic strip known as Junkyard Joe. This comic strip is very similar to the comics I grew up on, such as The Peanuts or Calvin and Hobbes, which surprisingly do also show up in this title. In the first issue of this title, we see where Muddy got the inspiration for his comic strip, that being a real-life robotic soldier that he encountered during the Vietnam War. Muddy and his fellow soldiers named this mysterious robot Joe during their time in the war and even began to treat him as one of their own. Through these memories, we see that Joe even begins to act more human, playing cards, helping his brothers through difficult terrain, and more. There's a shocking turn in the comic that Johns cited as wanting to be realistic to the war itself, when a platoon member of Muddy is shot through the cheek and drops dead. The Vietnam War, as all wars, was brutal, and the effects it had on those involved are still being unraveled to this day. Johns is not making light of the situation here. He wants us to know how horrible this place is. Joe, a machine made solely for killing, does his job extremely well. So well that during a firefight with Vietnam soldiers, he kills a child. From this moment, Joe shuts himself off from his masters, the US government, and walks away into the forest. We then pick up years later as Muddy is retiring from his job as that cartoonist, due to the passing of his late wife, Rita. Muddy was strong-armed when in the service to believe that Joe was simply a hallucination, something he dreamed up, which is why he turned the idea into a cartoon, spawning merchandise, an animated special on TV, and so much more. Seriously, Junkyard Joe is everywhere. Everyone in the world and the small town that this story takes place in knows about the fictional Junkyard Joe. But it's the appearance of the real Joe that sets everything into motion. On a snowy night after Muddy experiences a dream about his time in Vietnam, he finds Joe on his doorstep. Still believing that he is dreaming, Muddy denies himself what his eyes are seeing, until a tender moment between man and machine is shared, when he asks Joe if he even understands what he's lost. They stand together in the hallway as Joe takes off his helmet to honor Muddy's late wife. A really touching moment in this comic. Muddy and Joe are not the only characters to follow though, as the Munn family has moved in across the street. The Munns are interesting in a way, as they act as our windows into this world, being the newcomers in town. Sam Munn, the father of the family, has moved his children, Grace, Emily, and Will, across the country for a new job opportunity after the passing of his wife. Obviously, this is a parallel to Muddy, who has lost his wife, but the comic never really explores this aspect too much. Emily Munn is an artist and takes an interest in Muddy, so much so that she discovers Joe in his home. In a very E.T.-inspired kind of way, Muddy and Emily have to work together to keep Joe hidden from the public, and unbeknownst to them, Joe's creator, who is coming to retrieve him no matter the cost of human lives. And this is my biggest issue with the comic. Muddy, Joe, Emily, Grace, Will, and Sam all share a bit of the spotlight in the later issues, and it feels like it's really stretched thin. In my mind, I really thought the story would mainly be about Emily and Muddy, two artists who have lost someone important in their lives, learning to bond over their loss and taking care of Joe. And while some of that is true, the other characters seem to get in the way. We also have to deal with Sam's loss of his wife. Additionally, Grace and Will have trouble fitting in at school. And on top of all that, the antagonist of the story, Joe's creator and his henchmen, are never too far behind in tracking down their property. So how do all of these aspects come together in the end? Well, they just kind of get smooshed together. I understand the type of story Johns is trying to tell here, but I feel like he needed 1 to 2 more issues to do it justice. Grace and Will are mostly nobodies by the end of the comic. Sam does get a bit of redemption after admitting that he's been running away from the grief of losing his wife, and Muddy and Emily do connect over art, but really only in one panel in the entire comic. Joe is discovered by his creator, and he defeats them rather quickly, without much fanfare. Homeland Security shows up to reclaim Joe after the final battle, but the town rallies around him to protect him, claiming that Joe is family. Emily becomes Muddy's new inspiration to continue the Junkyard Joe comic, and everyone lives happily ever after. All of these aspects and story beats are great in concept, but it's the execution that's lacking. Muddy and Joe both suffer from PTSD, but this idea is never furthered or commented on. Who is Joe's creator? No idea, he's just some guy. Do the Mun kids ever fit in at school? No clue. Look, I understand that comics are limited. You can't always have every question answered in detail, and that's okay. But my issue here is not that the questions aren't answered, but rather there are too many questions to begin with. I love stories that make me think of E.T., an alien-like creature who has to hide in town under a large coat or is secretly very dangerous and must learn to live peacefully with his neighbors. But Junkyard Joe is juggling too much, in my opinion. The start of the comic is gruesome, as it should be, showing us the horrors of the Vietnam War. We see these ideas furthered as Joe and Muddy struggle with what they have done in the past, but then the comic almost switches tones to a goofy family adventure as the Muns run around town with Joe, hiding from the evil creator who wants to rule the world. Junkyard Joe is not a bad comic by any means, it's simply lacking. The reason I made this video is because I needed to get my true thoughts out of my head and accept the fact that the comic, which I had decided I loved before even reading it, was not all that I had hoped it to be. I won't be selling my copy anytime soon, but I am glad that I found this trade paperback for cheap at a local store rather than buying the deluxe hardcover, as spending that amount of money might have made me even more disappointed in it. I know that Joe does appear in some issues of Geiger, but I'm not here to discuss other comics. However, I would love it if Johns was able to make a collection of the actual Junkyard Joe comic strips that Muddy created, as I think that would be a really fun read. Have you read through Junkyard Joe? If not, are you interested after this video? I'd love to hear what you guys think. See you later.